Hello student, welcome to lecture 3.1 African Americans and the Causes of a Civil War. In this lecture we will cover many different things, but first we will start with a summary of a civil war and of the two types of explanation of its causes. Then we will talk about the so-called underlying causes of the Civil War, which include the Vilmore Proviso in 1845, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and the book entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Furthermore, we will talk about other underlying causes, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, with the notion of popular sovereignty, the Dred Scott case, the Lincoln-Douglas debate of 1858, John Brown and the raid on Harper's Ferry, and finally, we will discuss the direct causes of a civil war, which really had to do with one man and one election. The man was Abraham Lincoln, and the election was the presidential election of 1860. This election led to the secession of the southern states and the attack on the Union fort, the Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which started the Civil War. So, while slavery may have to do with a civil war, it was always in the background. It was not the direct cause of a civil war. So, we have to be careful when we say that it was slavery that was the main cause of a civil war. First of all, before talking about all of the different causes, let's talk about the Civil War itself. Let's summarize it in a few words. So the Civil War was that dramatic war between the northern states, or the Union, and the southern states, also known as the Confederate States. The war started in April 1861 and ended in April 1865. The major consequences of the war were the death of more than 600,000 people, and according to statistics, more than 1 million Americans either died or were wounded during the war. The economy also was destroyed, especially the economy of the southern states, and finally the war ended with the victory of the North. So the South lost the war, and that's how also slavery ended. A complete explanation of the causes of a civil war should take in consideration, on the one hand, the so-called underlying causes, which means long-term causes or conditions, and on the other hand, we have also to consider the direct causes or triggers of the war. So these underlying causes include, in a nutshell, in a summary, they include the sectional division, the geographic division between the northern states, which happen to be more industrialized, and the southern states, which were more agricultural and had to rely on slavery. So that's one division. The other division has to do with the ideology, which means people's opinion about the practice of slavery, and also about the supremacy of one race. So the people in the North tend not to believe in slavery, and also did not really believe in white supremacy, whereas the people in the South practiced slavery and believe totally in white supremacy. So white people has to be superior to black people according to the people in the South. Another division is a political division over the rights of a state. So the people in the southern state believe that the states had sovereignty. So this is what they call states' rights. So the direct cause, like I said earlier, include the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, which prompted the southern state to secede from the Union. And as soon as they seceded from the Union, they tried to make sure that the territory was secure. So this led them to attack the Union fort at Fort Sumter, which is in South Carolina and in the port of Charleston. So this led Lincoln to retaliate and fight to preserve the Union. So let's discuss all of these underlying causes of a civil war. And we will start with the Vilmore Proviso, which was one of the major issues that triggered the hostility between the political leaders in the North and those in the South. The Vilmore Proviso was a bill, which means a law proposal, introduced in Congress in 1845 to prohibit slavery in any land acquired from Mexico. So you may know that the United States and Mexico had a war in 1845, and as a result of that war, the United States acquired the territories of Texas and New Mexico and California. So the bill was to prohibit slavery in those new territories. But this bill did not pass. But even though it did not pass, the people in the South were really angry because they felt that the people in the North wanted to eliminate slavery everywhere in the United States. And it also, according to them, it was an attempt to destroy their livelihood, because their livelihood depend on slavery. Another issue that divided the North and the South and increased the hostility between the two parties was the admission of California in 1850. So California applied for statehood in 1850. As a condition for its admission, Senator Clay proposed the Compromise of 1850. According to this compromise, California would be admitted as a free state, but in exchange, Congress would pass a strong fugitive slave law to satisfy the southern states. So like I said again, this compromise did not pass, but there were two separate bills, two separate laws that was passed by Congress. First, California was admitted as a free state, so there's no discussion about that. Next, Congress also passed a second law which established a new fugitive slave law for the whole country. So let's talk about these different fugitive slave laws. So there was an early fugitive slave law passed in 1793, which permitted the recovery of escaped or runaway slaves. But this law was too weak to overcome Northern resistance. So the people in the North usually help the runaways to flee the South. So state officials also were not obligated to help the slave catcher at that time. So because of that, the people in the South lost many slaves. So they asked for a new law, new fugitive slave law, which was passed in 1850. And according to this law, which was the harshest slave law ever passed by Congress, everyone were required to help capture the runaway. So that include not only the state officials in the north, but also regular citizens in the north. So surprisingly, even a book written about the life of slave was enough to anger the people in the South. In 1851 and 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe, that's the name of the author, published a series of novels and then a book entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book described the misery of a slave called Uncle Tom. And the book was a bestseller because in just 1 year there were 300,000 copies sold in the North. But the people in the South were really angry. They thought that the book was a false description of their way of life, and also a false depiction of a life of a slave. And the author herself never visited the South. But the deadliest issue that divided the North and the South was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that was passed by Congress in 1854. This act was introduced by the Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas in 1854 to organize Kansas and Nebraska territory, and it introduced the notion of popular sovereignty, which means that a state can be either a slave state or a free state, depending on the vote of the people who lived in the state. So the settler would decide whether slavery would be legal or not. But the result was that there was a fight between pro-slavery and anti-slavery citizens in Nebraska, so in Kansas and Nebraska, and that led to the death of more than 200 men. There was another case that increased even more the divide between the North and the South. So that was the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott and his family were enslaved in Missouri, which was a slave state at that time. But they moved to Illinois, which was a free state where slavery was illegal. So they did not sue right away at that time. But after the death of the owner, Scott and his wife sue for their freedom. So they bring the lawsuit in the court, which they lost in the state court. But the case went all the way to the Supreme Court with the help of friends who founded and helped Dred Scott and his wife. And the decision of the Supreme Court in 1857 was really surprising, because the Supreme Court said that black people were not citizens. Therefore, they have no right to bring a lawsuit in court. So they don't have a constitutional right, and they were considered to be a property. So that was the decision of the Supreme Court, and the people in the North were infuriated by this decision, but the people in the South were happy about that decision. Now let's move to the direct causes of a civil war. Like I said earlier, these direct causes had to do with one man and one election. So the man was Abraham Lincoln, and the election was the election of 1860. But before talking about the election in 1860, let's talk about the man first. So Abraham Lincoln had a different debate with Stephen Douglas when they were still running for the state Senate of Illinois. During this debate, Lincoln showed that he didn't really like slavery, and he even abhorred the division of the United States. And during the debate, the two men spent their time arguing over slavery, its expansion, the Dred Scott case, and also even about African Americans. But during this election, or state election, Stephen Douglas won the Senate seat, but the debate made Lincoln a famous politician around the country, and one of his sentence and one of his phrase was even famous everywhere, and that phrase was, "A house divided cannot stand." So that made Lincoln a famous man. So here we have a photo of Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. So Lincoln is on the left and Stephen Douglas on the right. A direct attack on slavery before the Civil War was John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry was a military base in Virginia in 1859. John Brown was a religious man, but he was a violent man also. So he wanted to end slavery in the South by arming the slaves and killing the masters. So in order to achieve this plan, he gathered a small group of 20 men to attack the U.S. military base at Harper's Ferry. The attack failed, so they didn't succeed to get the weapons they needed. However, John Brown was captured and hanged, but this attack demonstrated that some people in the North, white people in the North, were willing to die to end slavery. Finally, as mentioned several times earlier, the direct cause of a civil war had to do with the election of 1860. The election of 1860 featured 4 candidates. The first one was John Bell, a constitutional union candidate. Then you have John Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat candidate. And you have also the other man famous at that time, Stephen Douglas, who was a Northern Democrat, and finally Abraham Lincoln. So, as you know, Abraham Lincoln won this election, but as soon as he was declared victorious of this election, as soon as he was declared a winner, the Southern state decided to secede from the Union because they thought that Abraham Lincoln was going to end slavery. So, the election of Abraham Lincoln led to the other cause, which was the secession of the Southern states. So, let's talk about the secession of the Southern states. The first state to secede from the Union was the state of South Carolina in December of 1860, which was followed by 6 other southern states before the war started in April 1861, and then you have 4 more states joining the Confederate States as the war broke out. The seceding sovereign state form what is known as the Confederate States of America, CSA, or Confederacy. They elected a new president, which was Jefferson Davis. They also established the capital city first in Montgomery, Alabama, until May 1861, and then they moved the capital city to Richmond, Virginia, until the end of the Civil War in 1865. The Confederate States started the Civil War because they were the ones who started the attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. So that's how the Civil War between the North and the South started. This map shows us the northern states, or the Union, in blue color, and the southern states, or Confederate States, in red. The states in yellow were slave states, so they should have been part of the South. But they decided not to join the southern state during the Civil War because Abraham Lincoln did not decide to end slavery right away. So Abraham Lincoln managed to keep his slave states as part of the Union. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. So that concludes this lecture, lecture 3.1. Please complete the reading and then move to lecture 3.2 to continue this module.